Hi, geometry. This is lesson 3, special right triangles. So we talked a little bit about special right triangles this year, but we really let you use trig to find these missing sides or Pythagorean theorem, and we let you write them as decimals. But next year, you really need to know these special right triangles, and they are 45, 45, 90, and 30, 60, 90. So the deal with a 45, 45, 90 triangle, it's actually an isosceles right triangle. So these sides right here are both the same. And I'm going to call each of those sides 1. That's called the legs of the right triangle or the isosceles right triangle. So 1 and 1 is the leg. And then you can actually use the Pythagorean theorem to get this hypotenuse here. You can do 1 squared plus 1 squared equals x squared. This hypotenuse is going to come out to radical 2 always. So what's special about these, if the legs are both 5, okay, this is going to come out to 5 radical 2. If the legs are both 6, this is going to come out to 6 radical 2, the hypotenuse. So whatever these legs are, the hypotenuse is that same number, but a radical 2. And you can always use the Pythagorean theorem if you're unsure about what the sides are for 45, 45, 90, because both of these sides are the same. These legs are congruent to each other. All right. So if we looked at question 1, this side right here is 8. This is 90. This is 45. So that basically means that this angle right here is also going to be 45. Okay, so right there is 45, which means that these two sides are congruent to each other. So this side right here is going to also be 8. Oops, I'm not sure why it says 88 right there, but that should say 8. So let's get rid of that. Let's cross out that 8 right there. Okay, so that should just be 8. Now, this right here will be 8 radical 2, but let me show you how that works. Basically, the proportion, if you want to set up a proportion, if it's like this, you don't need to, but sometimes the sides have a radical in them. Sometimes the hypotenuse, they give you the hypotenuse and the hypotenuse doesn't have a radical in it. So it's not in this nice form right here. So what you can always do is set up the proportion. So 1 is the leg, radical 2 is the hypotenuse. So 8 is the leg, and y is the hypotenuse. So look at this right here. 1 is the leg, radical 2 is the hypotenuse. That's the rule for the 45, 45, 90. 8 in this particular triangle is the leg, and y is the hypotenuse. And then I'm just going to cross multiply that. 1 times y is just y, and 8 times radical 2 is 8 radical 2. And that's my answer. So same thing here. This is another 45, 45, 90 triangle. So actually y is going to be 25. So that side is easy because these two sides are congruent to each other. And based off this triangle up here, that x is just going to be 25 radical 2. But let me show you why. Again, the proportion is always 1 is the leg, radical 2 is the hypotenuse. 25 is the leg, x is the hypotenuse, and then I just go and I cross multiply. 1 times x is x, 25 times radical 2 is 25 radical 2. All right, so the reason I've been showing you this proportion is because the next problem is a little bit different. It's still a 45, 45, 90 triangle, but this time I'm giving you the hypotenuse, and the hypotenuse does not have a radical in it. If this was, 19 radical 2, then I would know these sides are 19, but it's not like that. So the only way to do this is really work with this proportion. So 1 is the leg, radical 2 is the hypotenuse. The leg is x, the hypotenuse is 19. I'm going to cross multiply. Okay, so 1 times 19 is 19. X times radical 2 is x radical 2. So I cross multiply. And now to solve for x, I'm going to divide by radical 2. So both sides get divided by radical 2. And I'm going to have, x equals 19 over radical 2. Okay, so all I did was I divided by radical 2, divided by radical 2 here. Now the problem is we can't leave a radical in the denominator, and we did that when we were simplifying our radicals. So what I do is I multiply the numerator and the denominator by that radical 2. that is going to get rid of this radical in the denominator. 19 times radical 2 is 19 radical 2. Radical 2 times radical 2 is radical 4, which equals 2. So this answer is going to be 19 radical 2 over 2. Again, 19 times radical 2 is 19 radical 2. Radical 2 times radical 2 is radical 4, which equals 2. And you don't have to do it for x and y. You just have to do one of them because we know that those sides are congruent to each other. All right, so this is the rule up here. The sides, the legs are both 1. The hypotenuse is 1 radical 2. But if it does not fall into that nice format, you're just setting up a proportion. Now, the 30, 60, 90 is probably one that we'll use more next year in trig, so it is important that you know that. The shorter leg is across from the smaller angle. So this angle right here is 30. That's the smaller angle. My shorter leg is across from that. My shorter leg is going to be 1. The longer leg is across from the bigger angle, and that's 60 degrees. So across from the 60 degrees is my longer leg. That's going to be radical 3. And I'll explain down on the bottom why that is. But for right now, I'm just going to tell you the rule. The hypotenuse is across from the right angle. At this point, you could do the Pythagorean theorem to figure out this hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is going to be that same number that is across from the 30-degree angle, but doubled. So I take whatever number's across from the 30-degree angle and I double it. So it's twice that. So the shorter leg is 1. The hypotenuse is 2, twice the shorter leg. And the side across from the 60-degree angle, the longer leg, is 1 radical 3. Okay? So that's the rule. Now here's why. So down below is an explanation. You don't really need to write anything in there. In an equilateral triangle, all sides are equal. So this is my equilateral triangle right down here. All my sides are 8. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the altitude of that triangle. Okay, so I'm going to draw this altitude right here. This altitude now divides this triangle into 2 separate triangles. Now remember, in an equilateral triangle, each of these angles were 60, but now I've cut that triangle in half by the altitude. I now have a 30, 60, 90 triangle right here that I highlighted in yellow for us. Okay, so the original triangle, my angles were all 60, my sides were all 8. The altitude cuts that base in half, so now this base is 4. Okay, and this is still 8, and I made these numbers up. I made all the sides 8 to start with. But now you can see that that altitude cuts that base in half, and I have this nice 30, 60, 90 triangle. I know the hypotenuse is 8. The side across from the 30 is 4 because I cut that base in half. And then I can do the Pythagorean theorem, which I did over here. 4 squared plus x squared equals 8 squared. 4 squared is 16. 16 plus x squared equals 64. I subtract 16 from 64 and I get 48. So x squared equals 48. To solve for x, I need to take the square root of 48. So x is the square root of 48. And then we just worked on simplifying radicals before. Radical 48 breaks down to radical 16 and radical 3. I write the perfect square first. Radical 16 is 4. So then I can see that this side right here is 4 radical 3. So the side across from the 30 is 4. The hypotenuse is twice that. And the side across from the 60 is the same number as the side across from the 30, but it's 4 radical 3. Okay, so summary, the side across from the 30-degree angle is x. The side across from the 90-degree angle is 2x. And the side across from the 60-degree angle is x radical 3. So these are the proportions that I'm going to work with right here. If I'm working with the 30 and the 90, I'm going to work with 1 and 2. If I'm working with the 30 and the 60, I'm going to work with 1 and radical 3. So in this particular one, we're probably going to set up these proportions more. And if you flip this over to the next page, you will see that. So let's try a few together, and then if you want to pause the video and try some on your own, you can do that. All right, so on this particular problem, I have, again, a 30, 60, 90. So this angle up here is 30. The side across from the 30 is 5. Well, that makes the hypotenuse twice that. So that y is going to actually be 10. And the side across from the 60 is going to be the same number 5, but 5 radical 3. Now, if you memorize that, that's great. And if it is in the same format that I taught it to you in, wonderful. But what if it's not? If I'm dealing with the 30 and the 60, remember the proportion is 1 and radical 3. So again, the 30 and the 60, it's 1 and radical 3. Well, the side across from the 30 is 5, and the side across from the 60 is x. And then all I do is cross multiply to solve that. All right, so if you remember these proportions, you're all set. The 30 and the 90, the proportion is 1/2. So the side across from the 30 is 1. The side across from the 90 is twice that, 2. So 1/2. The side across from the 30 in this particular problem was 5. The side across from the 90 is y. And then I cross multiply and I solve that. Right? So if you memorized it and it fits into the correct form, boom, you can just write your answers. Otherwise, we're writing these proportions out. So like right here with the 30 and the 90, remember the proportion for the 30 and the 90 is 1/2. So 1/2 is the proportion. Well, the side across from the 30 is 14. Here's my 30, here's my 14. The hypotenuse is x, so that's my proportion. 1/2 equals 14 over x, and then I just cross multiply and I solve, and my answer is 28. The proportion for 30 and 60 is 1 and radical 3. So the side across from the 30 is 14, and the side across from the 60 is y. So again, my proportion for the 30 and the 60 is 1 and radical 3. So 1 over radical 3 equals 14 over y, and I cross multiply, and I get 14 radical 3. Right? So if you have these proportions memorized, it will work for any problem. So remember the proportion for the 30 and the 90 is 1/2. Now look at this one. I have the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is 32. The side across from the 30 is x. So the proportion for 30 and 90 is 1/2. 1 over 2, because the side across from the 30 and the side across from the 30 in this problem, right here, here's my 30. The side across is x. The hypotenuse goes on the bottom. The hypotenuse is 32. And then I just cross multiply. 2 times x is 2x. 1 times 32 is 32. I divide by 2, and x is 16. Now the rule for the 30 and the 60 is 1 over radical 3. The side across from the 30 is x, but I just figured that out. It's 16. And the side across from the 60 is y. So 1 over radical 3, that's the 30 and the 60. 16 is the side across from the 30, and then y is the side across from the 60. I cross multiply that, and at 1 times y is y. 16 times radical 3 is 16 radical 3. Okay? If you want to stop the video because you need to write anything, or if you want to pause the video and try some of these on your own, you can do that, and then you can play it again and see if you got this right. So we have some mixed up here. We have some 45, 45, 90, and some 30, 60, 90. You have to, flip back to the first page if you're trying to remember what these proportions are, and that would be fine. So this one I have a 45 and a 90. So the rule is the side from the 45 and 90, the proportion is 1 over radical 2. So 1 over radical 2. Now the side across from the 45 is 13. The hypotenuse is y. So 1 over radical 2 equals 13 over y. I cross multiply. 1 times y is y. 13 times radical 2 is just 13 radical 2. Now you don't have to do this again to find x, because x is the same thing that this other leg is. X is just 13. All right? 30, 60, 90 triangle in number 8. Think about what the proportion for the 30 and the 90 are. the proportion for the 30 and the 90 is 1/2. The side across from the 30 is 3, and the hypotenuse is x. So 1 over 2, 1/2, equals 3 over x. So I'm keeping the 30 on top, the 90 on the bottom. The side across from the 30 on top, this the hypotenuse, the side across from the 90 on the bottom. I cross multiply. 1 times x is x, 2 times 3 is 6. Now the proportion for the 30 and the 60 is 1 over radical 3. So the 1 goes on top, radical 3 goes on the bottom. The side across from the 30 is 3, and the side across from the 60 is y. So 1 over radical 3, the side across from the 30 is 3, the side across from the 60 is y. Cross multiply. 1 times y is y, 3 times radical 3 is 3 radical 3. If we can do these, then we'll be able to do anything, even if they start changing which side they give you or which one has radicals in it, you'll be able to solve them because they can get a little bit harder. So number 9, they give me the hypotenuse, so I got to start with that. I got to start with something that has a proportion with the 90 in it. The proportion for the 30 and the 90 is 1/2. So 1 goes on top, 2 goes on the bottom. The side across from the 30 is y, and the side across from the 90 is 34. So 1 over 2 equals y over 34. Cross multiply. 2 times y is 2y. 1 times 34 is 34. Then to solve for y, I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And that gives me y equals 17. Okay, so I got that one. So that's basically y is the side across from the 30. Now to do the 30 and the 60, that proportion is 1 over radical 3. So 1 over radical 3 equals y, well, not y, I know what this is now. This is 17. 17 over x. So again, 30 goes on top, 60 goes on the bottom. The proportion is 1 over radical 3. The side across from the 30 is 17. We did that right back here. And the side across from the 60, I don't know that, that's x. I cross multiply. 1 times x is x. 17 times radical 3 is 17 radical 3. Okay? Number 10. Pause the video if you need to, if you want to try some of these on your own or you just have to catch up with writing stuff. 10 is a 45, 45, 90 triangle. The rule for the 45, 45, 90 triangle is the proportion is 1 over radical 2. So 45 goes on top, 90 goes on the bottom. So I'm going to have 1 over radical 2. Now, I don't know the side across from the 45. I don't have either of them. What I have is the side across from the 90. So 1 over radical 2 equals x over 10 radical 2. Okay, so the proportion, the side across from the 45 is 1, side across from the 90 or the hypotenuse is radical 2. In our problem, the side across from the 45 is x, and the hypotenuse or the side across from the 90 is 10 radical 2. Now when I go to cross multiply, 1 times 10 radical 2 is 10 radical 2. X times radical 2 is x radical 2. All right, and this one, even though I have some radical 2's going on, it's not too bad because to solve for x, think about what you have to get rid of. I need to get rid of this radical 2, so I'm going to divide both sides by radical 2, and when I do that, that's going to cancel out, and I'm going to get x equals 10. All right, so x equals 10, and y, of course, is just the same thing. All right. 11, I have a 45, 45, 90 triangle. I have the hypotenuse. Okay, so this one's going to take a little bit more work on cross multiplying. You really need to use this proportion. So the rule for the 45, 45, 90 triangle, the side across from the 45 is 1. The side across from the 90 is radical 2. Now, in this particular problem, I don't know the side across from the 45, but I do know the side across from the 90. So my proportion is going to be 1 over radical 2 equals x over 30. Let's make sure that makes sense. Side across from the 45 is 1. The side across from the 45 right here is x. The side across from the 90 is radical 2. And this one, the side across from the 90 is 30. Now, when I go to cross multiply, x times radical 2 is x radical 2. 1 times 30 is 30. To solve for x, I need to divide both sides by radical 2. Okay, so I'm going to divide by radical 2, and I'm going to get, so right here, I got to divide by radical 2. Oops, there it is. And I get 30 over radical 2, right? So 30 divided by radical 2. Now I need to rationalize the denominator. I cannot have a radical in the denominator, so I multiply the top and the bottom by radical 2. 30 times radical 2 is 30 radical 2. Radical 2 times radical 2 is radical 4, which equals 2. So 30 radical 2 over 2. These are not radicals. These can be simplified. 30 divided by 2 is 15. So each of these legs are 15 radical 2. Okay, and my last one, I have a 30, 60, 90, but it's a little bit different. I'm giving you the side across from the 60. So let's work with the 30 and the 60 first. The proportion for the 30 and the 60 is 1 over radical 3. Now, I don't have the side across from the 30, that's my x, but I do have the side across from the 60, and that's 15 radical 3. So 30 over 60, the proportion is 1 over radical 3 equals x over 15 radical 3. Now you're going to cross multiply and solve for x. So x times radical 3 is x radical 3. 1 times 15 radical 3 will just stay 15 radical 3. And to solve for x, I need to divide both sides by radical 3, and I'm just going to get x is 15. So now I know the side across from the 30 is x, and the rule for the 30 and the 90 is the proportion is 1/2. So 1 over 2, the side across from the 30 is 15, and the side across from the 90, or the hypotenuse, is y. And then I just cross multiply. 1 times y is y, 2 times 15 is 30. If you know that the side across the hypotenuse is just twice the side across from the 30, you can certainly do this without the proportion. I just wanted everyone to be comfortable with these proportions. Okay? And that's the video.